Welcome to UBI Unplugged, breaking down the future of income.
All right, let's see what the future holds, or if it even exists with UBI, eh?
Well, hopefully, we can at least have a productive discussion about the possibilities and the very real challenges today.
Exactly. I think it's a crucial conversation to be having, especially considering all the anxieties around automation and the rising cost of living, coupled with some disturbing news in the headlines. I mean, you see these articles about former Trump voters regretting their choice because they're still struggling economically. It just screams for a more direct solution like UBI, right?
Regret is their main emotion because they are struggling economically. Maybe they regret it because they bought into something that didn't work out and they now see it differently.
Well, regret can stem from a lot of places, but disillusionment with economic promises is definitely a big factor. I think it's important to dig into the why behind that regret, what specific economic concerns are driving it, and whether UBI could actually address those specific issues in a sustainable way.
And that's where the nuclear energy piece comes in. I mean, if we're talking about funding UBI, we need sustainable and reliable sources of revenue. And next generation nuclear, the kind that produces very little waste, could potentially be a big part of that. Think about it. Stable energy prices, good paying jobs, and a consistent revenue stream for social programs.
Okay, hold on. You're jumping from people regretting a vote to nuclear power funding UBI. It's a pretty big leap, right? And nuclear, seriously? We're talking about the same nuclear that gave us Chernobyl and Fukushima. You want to trust that with everything?
Otto's right to be skeptical, I think. Nuclear power, while potentially clean in terms of carbon emissions, has a lot of baggage. The waste disposal problem is huge, and the risk of accidents, however small, is still there. We need to be realistic about the ethical and environmental considerations before we even think about relying on it to fund something like UBI.
Of course. I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but we can't just dismiss it out of hand, especially when we're talking about next generation reactors. They're designed to be much safer with passive safety features that prevent meltdowns. And the waste issue is being addressed with new technologies that can recycle spent fuel. Plus, the urgency of climate change.
Urgency. Sure. But trading climate change for a potential nuclear disaster? That's a hard bargain. And what about the cost? These new reactors, they're not cheap, right? Where's that money coming from? And how does that impact the overall feasibility of UBI?
Exactly. The cost-benefit analysis has to be incredibly rigorous. And it's not just about the initial investment. It's about the long-term maintenance, the decommissioning costs, and the potential liabilities in case of an accident. All of that needs to be factored into the equation when we're talking about using nuclear energy to fund a social safety net.
Okay, valid points. But let's not forget the potential economic benefits beyond just the revenue stream for UBI. We're talking about creating a whole new industry with high-paying jobs in engineering, manufacturing, and research. And that could help revitalize communities that have been left behind by the changing economy.
Revitalize with nuclear power? Sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. And those high-paying jobs, they require specialized skills, right? What about the people who don't have those skills? How does UBI help them get those jobs? Or does it just become another handout?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? How does UBI fit into a broader strategy for workforce development? It can't just be a passive income stream. It needs to be coupled with programs that help people acquire new skills, start their own businesses, and participate more fully in the economy. Otherwise, it could just exacerbate existing inequalities.
That's right. UBI is not meant to be a replacement for opportunity, but a foundation for it. It gives people the breathing room to pursue education, training, or entrepreneurship without the constant pressure of just surviving. And yes, we need to invest in those support systems alongside UBI to make it truly effective.
Breathing room or a reason to not bother? I'm sorry, I'm just thinking about the incentive structure. If you're getting paid for doing nothing, where's the drive to do something? And how do you prevent people from just, I don't know, gaming the system?
The incentive question is a big one, and it's something that needs to be addressed through careful policy design. We need to look at how UBI interacts with existing welfare programs and how we can avoid creating perverse incentives that discourage work. Maybe it's about phasing out certain benefits as income increases, or providing additional support for people who are actively seeking employment.
And the evidence we have so far from UBI trials suggests that people don't just stop working. They often use the money to improve their lives, start businesses, or invest in their communities. They're not suddenly becoming lazy. It's a myth.
Trials, small scale, short term. That's different from a nationwide program that's in place for years, decades. And what about the funding? You mentioned nuclear, but is that really sustainable? What happens when the price of uranium goes up? Or if there's another major nuclear accident that shuts down the industry? Does UBI just collapse?
Diversification is key. We can't rely on just one revenue source, whether it's nuclear energy or taxes on the wealthy or whatever. We need a mix of funding mechanisms that can withstand economic shocks and political changes. And we need to be constantly evaluating the program's performance and making adjustments as needed. It's not a set it and forget it kind of thing.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the political considerations. Because implementing UBI and building new nuclear plants is going to require a lot of political will. You're going to face opposition from powerful interest groups, from people who are ideologically opposed to government intervention, and from people who are just afraid of change.
Afraid? Good, because I am. It's a massive upheaval, a complete rethink of, well, everything. And you're expecting everyone to just sign on, especially when you have politicians who can't even agree on whether the sky is blue? Forget about it.
The current political climate is definitely a challenge, but I think the key is to frame UBI not as a handout, but as an investment in human potential, an investment in a more resilient and adaptable workforce, an investment in a more just and equitable society. And we need to build a broad coalition of support, from business leaders to labor unions to community organizations, to make it happen.
And that's where the ethical piece comes in, because UBI is not just about economics, it's about human dignity. It's about recognizing that every person has inherent worth, regardless of their employment status. And it's about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, not just survive.
Dignity, thrive? Those are nice words. But what about personal responsibility? What about the idea that you have to earn your way in the world? Is that just gone? Thrown out the window?
Personal responsibility is still important, but it shouldn't be used as an excuse to let people fall through the cracks. We live in a society where the rules of the game are often rigged against certain groups, where opportunities are not equally distributed. UBI can help level the playing field and give everyone a fair chance to succeed.
And to your point, Otto, the Trump voters who now regret their choice. Many of them were promised a return to a bygone era, a restoration of manufacturing jobs that aren't coming back. UBI could offer them a path forward, a way to adapt to the changing economy without being left behind.
So, it's a consolation prize. Sorry your job is gone, here's some money to shut you up? That doesn't sound like a solution. It sounds like, well, like a politician's empty promise.
It's not about shutting people up. It's about empowering them to make choices, to invest in themselves, their families, and their communities, to start businesses, pursue education, or simply have the security to say no to exploitative jobs.
Exactly. And think about the potential for innovation. If people aren't constantly worried about where their next meal is coming from, they're more likely to take risks, experiment, and create new things. UBI could unleash a wave of creativity and entrepreneurship that benefits everyone.
Creativity? Okay, maybe. But what about the basics? Food, housing, healthcare. UBI might give you some extra cash, but does it really address those fundamental needs? Or does it just inflate the prices of everything so that you're back where you started?
Inflation is a real concern. We need to be mindful of how UBI interacts with the broader economy. We need to invest in affordable housing, expand access to healthcare, and address other structural issues that drive up the cost of living. UBI can't solve these problems on its own.
That's why it has to be part of a larger package. It's not just about giving people money, it's about creating a more just and sustainable society. And that includes addressing the climate crisis, investing in education and healthcare, and reforming our political system.
Reforming our political system? Now you're talking about something truly impossible. I mean, look at what's happening with these headlines about potential legal issues with politicians. It just shows that the focus is on something other than actually solving problems.
Well, the political climate is definitely adding layers of complication. When trust in institutions is low, it's harder to get buy-in for big systemic changes like UBI. People are already skeptical, and these kinds of events just reinforce that skepticism.
And that skepticism is understandable, but it's also why we need to be bold and propose solutions that bypass the dysfunction. I mean, the fact that there's a potential suspension of habeas corpus being discussed, That's terrifying. It speaks to a breakdown of our fundamental rights. UBI in that context could be a buffer with a way to protect vulnerable populations from the worst consequences of political instability.
Buffer against the suspension of habeas corpus? That sounds extreme. You're saying UBI is the last line of defense against authoritarianism?
Maybe not the last line of defense, but it could certainly provide a degree of economic security that makes it harder for governments to control people through fear and coercion. If people have a basic level of income, they're less vulnerable to exploitation and more likely to stand up for their rights.
Exactly. And look at the recent reports of immigration enforcement actions. Imagine being a member of that community, constantly living in fear of deportation. UBI could provide a safety net, a sense of stability in the midst of that uncertainty.
So UBI is like a get out of jail free card for being here illegally. I can see that going over really well with everyone.
It's not about rewarding illegal behavior, it's about recognizing the humanity of everyone who lives in our society. It's about providing a basic level of support to people who are often marginalized and exploited, regardless of their immigration status. And it's about creating a more just and compassionate society for everyone.
And realistically, the economic impact of these mass deportations is devastating for local economies. UBI could help mitigate that damage, providing a lifeline for small businesses and communities that are disproportionately affected.
Mitigate. Okay. But what about the cost? I keep coming back to that. You're talking about providing income to everyone, including people who are here illegally, and somehow it's going to help small businesses? How does that math work?
The math is complicated, but the basic idea is that UBI would stimulate demand, boost economic activity, and create jobs. People with more money in their pockets are more likely to spend it at local businesses, which in turn creates more jobs and opportunities. And yes, that would include businesses that rely on immigrant labor.
And there are studies that show that immigrants, regardless of their legal status, contribute significantly to the economy. They start businesses, pay taxes, and fill essential labor needs. UBI could help them do that even more effectively.
Okay, but let's be real. There's always going to be people who try to take advantage of the system. People who lie, cheat, and steal. How does UBI address that? Does it just ignore it?
No system is perfect, and there will always be some level of fraud and abuse. But the key is to design the program in a way that minimizes those risks. That means using technology to verify identities, track payments, and detect suspicious activity. And it means having clear and consistent rules and enforcement mechanisms.
And honestly, the cost of fraud and abuse in a UBI system is likely to be far less than the cost of our current welfare system, which is riddled with bureaucracy and inefficiencies. UBI is a much simpler and more streamlined approach.
Simpler, maybe. But simpler doesn't always mean better. Sometimes the complexities are there for a reason, to protect against unintended consequences, to ensure that the system is fair and equitable.
That's a fair point. We need to be incredibly careful about how we design and implement UBI. We need to pilot programs, conduct rigorous evaluations, and be willing to make adjustments along the way. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
And it's not a static solution. The world is changing rapidly, and UBI needs to adapt to those changes. As automation continues to displace workers, as the gig economy becomes more prevalent, and as the cost of living continues to rise, UBI may become not just desirable, but essential.
Essential or a crutch, a way to avoid dealing with the real problems, a way to mask the fact that we're not creating enough good-paying jobs, that our education system is failing, that our healthcare system is broken.
It's both, potentially. UBI can be a crutch if it's not accompanied by other reforms, but it can also be a catalyst for change, a way to empower people to demand better jobs, better education, and better healthcare, a way to create a more just and sustainable society for all.
And going back to the nuclear energy piece, it's about more than just funding UBI. It's about creating a future where we're not dependent on fossil fuels, where we have access to clean and reliable energy, and where we're not contributing to the climate crisis.
So it's about saving the planet with nuclear power and free money? Sounds like a utopian fantasy.
It's ambitious, certainly, but it's not impossible. It requires a willingness to think big, to challenge the status quo, and to work together to create a better future. And it requires a healthy dose of skepticism to make sure we're not blinded by ideology or wishful thinking.
That's right. We need to be realistic about the challenges, but also optimistic about the possibilities. Because the future is not something that happens to us. It's something we create.
Create or stumble into. I'm still not convinced about UBI or about nuclear power, but I'm willing to keep talking about it. Maybe someday I'll be proven wrong.
And that's the spirit. The point isn't to agree on everything, but to have a constructive conversation about the challenges and opportunities facing our society, and to keep exploring new ideas, even if they seem radical or unconventional.
Well said, and that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on UBI Unplugged.
Yeah, thanks for listening. Or tolerating us.
And thanks for engaging with the discussion. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into the world of UBI.
Bye for now.